From the Squamish Chief.
This is the Squamish Sound. I'm Keili Bartlett.
And I'm Stephen Chua. This is the 18th episode of our weekly podcast.
You'll hear the story behind the story as we take you into the newsroom. We'll talk about what did and didn't get into the newspaper this week.
On the show today, we're covering the top of the world as local Clayton Matthews talks about climbing Mount Everest. And we're also going to be talking a little bit about Vanlife as our editor Jennifer Thuncher explores exactly how you can figure out a way to turn your van into a home. So a local named Clayton Matthews, you've probably seen him in our pages before, holding out pieces of the Squamish Chief at various stages of the Everest
Ascent,
yes.
Mm-hmm.
He has now completed his whole summit run. He's made it all the way to the top and is back here in Squamish.
I think people in general are very curious about Everest, whether or not they dream of doing it themselves or they just like to follow along other people's journeys. But what's really interesting about this season is that it's really taken over headlines again, especially May this month.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure a lot of you guys have probably seen the viral images that have been floating around. Basically, a lineup to the top of the summit of Everest, as if it was a Disneyland ride.
As
basically.
if it was traffic on a long weekend on the sea to sky. Clayton actually, when I spoke to him, he said that those photos were horrifying. So luckily for Clayton, a little bit of a spoiler, I guess, he summited the week before those lineups. Mm-hmm. So it was really interesting to speak with him and get his perspective of what that was like, of seeing what it could have been like for him if he'd gone a week later.
Climbing at Mount Everest is like an incredibly complicated task, and Clayton has been training for months and months.
Yes, 6 months.
He's going to be telling us a little bit about how the process of climbing Everest works and how he managed to beat some of the crowds and pass some of the people.
On our summit push, we got up at about 8 o'clock at night to leave at 9, and when I stepped out of the tent at about 9, I was the first one out of our group to leave camp. I looked up the mountain, and there was at least 40 people or more ahead of us already. People had already left at like 7 and 8 o'clock, so there was quite a few people that had a pretty good head start on us. And so most of the climbers were climbing on the left side of the fixed line because most people are right-handed, so they're climbing on the left side. So when I got to the first few slower groups, I ended up just pulling out my ice axe and climbing on the right side of the rope, unclipped, and just grabbing a hold of the fixed line whenever I needed a bit of a break with my left hand. And so when the groups would stop, I would pass a bunch of people and then grab back onto the rope. And then when I get to the next group and they would stop for a rest, I would pass them. So I ended up getting ahead of that whole group of 30 or 40 people and got in, and I had a huge empty space in front of me before there was the first summiters. The first summiters were on a different oxygen system. They had like a really high flow oxygen system, and they had Sherpas going along placing bottles for them. Mm-hmm. So they were moving, they were flying. There was no catching those guys. So those guys summited in the dark actually at about 5 o'clock in the morning. So I summited probably within the first 10 to 15 people. Those first groups that were on the high flow oxygen system, I passed them in the south summit. They were coming up, and that's as I was dropping down. And then, I had that viral photo that you see of the huge lineup near the summit on the Cornice Traverse. There was nobody along there for me. There was nobody on the Hillary step. When I got to the summit, there was only like 6 people. And we probably spent an hour there because my Sherpa had a bunch of flags and everything for his company and a bunch of stuff for his family that he wanted pictures with. And then I had a bunch of stuff as well. So by the time we take everything out and put it back in and take photos, we chewed up probably half an hour each, and then we left the summit. And then by the time we left the summit, there was a good 20 people up there for sure. I don't know if you've seen the picture and the video of the guy with the saxophone, but he got up there just as, he started playing just as I was leaving. So it was kind of surreal walking off the summit of Everest, but with somebody playing a saxophone in the background. It was pretty neat.
Yeah, so I thought that saxophone bit is so funny because you can't ever really predict how your Everest expedition is going to go. And I think that's why people are so curious about it, because a lot of people who aren't experienced in the mountains or can't see themselves doing this, so many of the headlines around Everest are focused on death and the consequences of what that kind of expedition could end like. And having that saxophone is just such a random thing. You would never think that that's what your experience is going to be like on the top of the world, that somebody's playing jazz, I think it was.
Maybe it was Kenny G. Who
But,
yeah,
it's just, you don't know how these trips are going to go. And so we also asked Clayton if this was something that he was thinking about, the consequences of going up to Mount Everest.
When I seen the crowds, I initially wanted to get ahead of everybody just to stay, just for safety for one, and then and number two, I just basically, it's better to climb without big groups. So once I was ahead of everybody and up to the balcony, I really slowed down my pace, probably like at least half the pace that I was climbing at beforehand. And I just took my time to get to the summit. I had a full frame Sony camera with me, and I actually didn't take any photos. Like if you lose a glove, you lose a hand. So I didn't want to make any mistakes until I got to the summit. So I didn't really take many photos at all along the climbing route, up or down. And I didn't really pull my camera out until I got to the summit. And then, like I say, as soon as it was time to leave Camp 4, I went all the way back down to base camp just, to get out of the altitude. There's a lot of stories of people dying in their tents and stuff like that, and I just didn't want to be one of those people. So as soon as I got off of oxygen, and I just kept descending and getting down off the mountain was my number one priority. Get up and get down.
So that's a really interesting piece. The fact that you can't really stay and really savor your victory for that long. You kind of have to just kind of split.
And you'd be so exhausted by the time you get up there too, that how much of it can you actually enjoy? But I mean, I think for the people who go, it's the whole experience that you're going for. It's not really just that hour that you might get at the top. Yeah. And so let's talk a little bit about why this year was so different from previous years.
Yeah.
So what happened this year is Nepal, the government issued more permits than they have before, ever. And so I think this has been said to be because there have been previous recent Mount Everest seasons that have not had the same kind of weather opportunities. So not as many people have been able to, even though they had a permit, to even try to get onto Everest. There were really bad avalanche years. And so this year, there are so many more people trying to get on the mountain. And that's part of it. And then we spoke to Clayton also about what he thinks Nepal's role in that is.
There's a lot of people calling for Nepal to limit permits and to limit stuff that's going on there. But at the end of the day, Nepal just issues the permits, and they don't really have a say in when people climb. So it's not really Nepal's fault that there's huge lineups on certain days. It's up to the operators and the guided companies to communicate to one another and say, hey, we're going on this day or we're going on that day, and sort of try and minimize the crowds. A lot of what happened there was their own doing. The way I look at it, like I was the permit leader, so I had to go meet the Minister of Tourism before my permit was issued, and then a debrief afterwards. And they're super appreciative of us, of people going to their country and climbing or hiking or doing whatever, because tourism is that's like their number one source of revenue for the country, right? So, I mean, for them to limit permits is limiting how much money actually goes into their coffers. So I can't really see them doing that. And they shouldn't really have to do that because people on the mountain aren't coordinating the climbing properly, you know what I mean? So I think Nepal itself is kind of getting a bad rap for something that they can't really control.
So that's a a different perspective, because a lot of people have just been saying, hey, like Nepal should just really stop issuing all these permits. But at the same time, for a country like that, like what other option do they have? In a certain way, they've kind of become dependent on this source of income.
Right. And I mean, he has a really good point. It is these climbers and these companies that are buying into and profiting off of Mount Everest as well, that, you know, how would you even start to regulate that, right? You couldn't be like, sorry, your team has to go today whether or not the weather looks good, because then you'd be forcing people basically into a death march. So that's a really interesting perspective. I don't know if that's one that we see very often in the news when Everest is reported on. Definitely something to tune into and keep an eye on as the season progresses.
Absolutely. And I guess the next part that really stood out to me is the whole reason why I guess people go on these types of trips.
Risk their lives.
He had like this really beautiful passage in your story, and another one which we're about to hear, where he kind of just describes the sun coming over, seeing like one side, the Tibetan side, the Nepalese side, and then it's just like a really, really beautiful moment.
Yeah, what I really like about this moment, I got chills the first time I heard it. It was such a beautiful description, and what really stands out to me is that this moment isn't even the summit of Everest. This is before you get to the summit. This is on your way. It's almost in sight. And so he knows he's about to get there. But this moment it's not even the one that he's working towards. It's not getting to the summit, which is the point where I think everyone imagines what would it be like to stand on the top of the world. And so that's kind of a really interesting point. And Clayton's a photographer, so he brought a full frame camera with him up, and he added that load onto his already heavy equipment, and he didn't take a photo of this moment, which is really interesting. You know, that's one that only he's going to have ever seen.
So one of the coolest things that happened on the whole ascent was when actually where the viral picture is, people going across the Cornice Traverse, just below the Hillary Step where that huge lineup is. Well, when I was there was nobody, and that's actually when the sun rose for me. So when the sun came up, like it comes up on the right side, on the Tibet side, and that whole side of the Cornice Traverse, because it's snow, it was all just lit up pink. So the whole right side of that whole ridge line, the right hand side of it was all bright pink, and then the other side was a shadow. So I could literally take my right hand and dip it into Tibet, and it was like dipping into the sunrise. It was surreal. It was spectacular. It was one of the most stunning things I've ever seen in the mountains. I've summited, I've climbed, probably 100 mountains, but I've never had a summit day where I've been able to do that. And then you look to the left, and there was the classic shadow of Everest, the pyramid that just cascades for like 100 miles away. You know what I mean? Like the sunrise was unbelievable.
So what I thought was really fun from this interview was this wasn't just the only moment that stood out. There was a moment when Clayton was down off the mountain, and he was sharing some photos from his trip when it almost sounds like he got kind of homesick.
Little did he know, as he was busy conquering the top of the world, we had a great stretch of weather here in Squamish.
It was so beautiful.
So good. Clayton, you missed out.
So let's hear about how he, from the top of the world, was jealous of what we were getting up to in Squamish.
I was actually thinking about rock climbing quite a bit. It looks like Squamish had a pretty good stretch of decent weather, and a lot of my friends were rock climbing, and I was getting lots of, even though I was posting stuff being on Everest, I was actually kind of jealous of all the good climbing that was going on in Squamish while I was gone. So as soon as I got home, I really wanted to get out. But the first couple of days I was tired, and then yesterday I figured I'd give it a shot, and I was pretty slow, but I had a lot of fun. It was great to be back out on the rock.
And of course, we're all really curious to know what kind of adventure he's going to be up to. This is not going to be the last that we're going to be hearing from Clayton. He does have, it seems, ambitions to other big things. Am I right?
You are definitely right. Let's hear what he's got in mind.
Actually, being in the Everest Base Camp, you meet a lot of people, and you get, I got a lot of opportunities for next spring. I just got to see if I can get some more time off work. But there's a Canadian expedition to Kanchenjunga, which is the third tallest mountain in the world. So it's another 8,000er. Mm-hmm. It's in like the far east of Nepal. It's not a very well-known mountain. Yes. But so there's an opportunity to go there. There's a bunch of my teammates from Everest this year. They want to go to Makalu next spring. Mm-hmm. So there's an opportunity there. And then I still want to get down to Antarctica and ski Mount Vincent. So that's kind of a big goal for me too. So I got some time here. I'll think about it and maybe make a decision here in the next month or so what to aim for next year. But there's definitely some mountains to climb for next year for sure.
If you want to hear more of Clayton's interview, tune in to a special edition of the Squamish Sound.
Okay, now we're going to bring in our editor, Jennifer Thuncher, where she's not going to do her editor's pick. It's going to be her editor's thing.
The editor's thing.
So it's not the most important thing.
Well, it's important. It's important, but I just feel bad when you do like a major court story, and I'm like, here, I'm talking about van conversions, even though it's interesting.
It is interesting, very, especially in a place like Squamish, where van life is a big thing. Now we're going to take another look at this, not so much from the municipal bylaw side, but more on the actual how these things actually get made.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I went to see Pura Vida Vans, which is in just outside of downtown Squamish, and it's Kate and Alex, and their company converts sort of sprinter vans into vans that either you can live in, as we know what we call van life, or for recreation, which is something we, prior to the last few years is what we would have thought of more commonly in Squamish. Right. So I went to their location, and it's really neat. They sort of strip either ones that have been used for other things, or they can take a new one. They had 4, I think, underway at the time. That they were working on. And so I have a video of a tour of Kate and Alex's actual own personal van that they converted. They can put their bikes in at the back. There's a whole area. So that's neat. And you could also live in it. And then I also have a story about what they do. So an interesting segment that I brought to you today is talking to Alex just a little bit about van life and his perspective on it. So I'll let him take it from here.
It's a fact of life. We're not going to get around. And the van life movement, it's been around since the 60s in California, and it has been around. It's more prominent now because obviously of social media and things like that, but also because of the cost of living. Yeah. The cost of living anywhere on the West Coast. If you look at wet vans, where they're prominent, they're all along the West Coast. As soon as you get any further past Canmore, Alberta, there's no more vans.
Right. There's none. You can rent for $500 or $600 a month. Vans.
So Alberta is kind of the cutoff point here. You'll get some in Quebec and Montreal. You'll get some in the east. There's a couple of van builders out there, but here it's really the West Coast. And the hotbed is Portland. That's really the hotbed in the States. We're starting to get pretty hot here now, and it's because of rent. Yeah. Right? And I think if the van life is managed, like big cities in the States now are realizing, hey, we have to do something. People are living in these things. And like San Diego, they just passed some bylaws to allow it in designated areas. So people can actually stay in designated areas and live there. Because they realized, hey, it is a fact of life. We're not going to stop it. San Diego area has got hundreds of van builders. And they're building like factories. They're building these things. Like Outside Vans, who's in Portland, they build about 40 vans a month.
Wow.
Coming out every month. So that's a lot of vans, right? And some of them are like these, recreational, but some are going to be for people that are living in them. And living in them means a lot of times, not that there's the people that are living in them for long term, but realistically, what's long term? Might be a year, might be 2 years, might be 5 years.
And it was funny because he was saying that he's near Walmart in Squamish, and there's dozens of them, the vans staying there. And then even in his own sort of parking lot, there was someone last night, I think, that stayed. But it's an interesting company. They're trying to buy all their supplies from other local dealers too. So it's an interesting thing where if Vanlife's going to be here, then the people who make it live here, and the suppliers to those factories or where they put them together should also be local, is what they were thinking. And yeah, they're beautiful. They started about 35,000 for a full conversion. So it's not your tent trailer for a few $100s on Craigslist. But then again, when you think of what it costs to buy a house and what you pay for rent,
right?
I want to do it. I'm excited. I'd like to do it, but one day.
Yes,
Thanks, Stephen.
You're welcome. Oh, it's you who's thanking me this time. Excellent. The tables have turned when it's no longer the editor's pick. Yeah.
The Squamish Sound is brought to you by the Squamish Chief. The music for this episode was produced by Stephen Chua, cover photo by Clayton Matthews. Have a story tip? Give us a call at 604-892-9161. Send an email to news@squamishchief.com. You can read these stories and more online at squamishchief.com, the newspaper, and have the news delivered to your door every week.